it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Magic is the channeling of what you feel into something you can touch and see. Now, first you have to believe, then you have to learn to translate emotions into words or words into emotions, and then images into either. The power of thought at the center of tonight's two stories, each one half of the same story. We begin tonight with I work in a morgue. I can't explain what I saw the Christmas of 2003. The town of Christian Springs was big enough to justify having its own cold storage, but far too small to make proper use of it. On average, I'd end up seeing about 5 bodies a month, most of them overdoses from the smaller towns nearby. My work at the morgue was quick and impersonal. No one that I could recognize ever ended up on my table, and the toxicology reports always came back with a clear-cut cause of death, usually something in the realm of opioids. What I saw in that fluorescent-lit room always stayed where it belonged. My work life and my family life were always two separate things. That all changed during the Christmas season of 2003. 2 local bodies were brought in within 24 hours of each other. Neither of them were like anything I'd ever seen. The first body belonged to Chelsea Steeler, a local first grader. After school let out for winter break, Steeler walked off the premises only to return a couple of minutes later. Bleeding from her mouth, Steeler stumbled through the school's playground, begged for help, then collapsed. She was pronounced dead as soon as emergency services arrived. And the second body I recognized, Christine Morgan. Morgan was someone that most people in the Christian Springs community would recognize. She was the crazy religious lady. Well, as the name of the town might imply, we had our fair share of Bible thumpers in town, but Morgan's breed of spirituality was considerably more aggressive than anything you could find being peddled by the televangelists the locals watched. Both of the cinemas in Christian Springs banned the woman from their premises on account of her interrupting screenings of even the most milquetoast of movies with her raving sermons. When the local museum set up a dinosaur exhibit, Morgan was banned from there too. To her, dinosaur bones were the work of Satan, created to lead true believers astray. It was Christine Morgan's daughter, 7-year-old Grace Morgan, who discovered the body. When I first heard this bit of information, I found myself pitying the child. The ruminations about Grace Morgan's well-being were soon whisked away by what I discovered during the autopsies. Both of the bodies exhibited internal damage, the likes of which I'd never seen or read about before. Their stomach lining was shredded to bits. Chunks of their livers were found inside their esophagus. Every internal organ that was still intact showed signs of extreme scarring. It was as if something had torn them up from the inside. The cause of death was a complete mystery. Aside from a shared geographical location, the 2 women had nothing in common, yet the severity of their injuries was almost identical. It was as if someone had planted bombs inside of them and sent tiny bits of shrapnel flying through their organs. Yet there was no shrapnel to be found. There was no clear trace of the instrument that had killed these women. On closer observation, however, I found something else that connected the 2 bodies. In the confounding mess of viscera, I found something that made their cause of death seem quaint by comparison. Even though they were bloodied and covered in loose chunks of flesh and membrane, I immediately knew what I was holding in my hands. I was holding 2 tiny gingerbread men. They were small, both fitting into the palm of my glove, but they still inspired fear. Unlike the big-eyed smiling gingerbread men that were sold in the local bakeries, the creations I held in my hand had tiny slits for eyes, and their mouths were stretched into long, harrowed screams that descended well into their torsos. The baked goods I held in my hand were the product of a disturbed mind. Well, I called just about everyone I went to school with. From the few colleagues that picked up, I couldn't find anyone who was willing to drive over and take a look at my findings. Everyone was either far too busy dealing with the personal aspects of the holiday season, or was swamped with the suicide spike that Christmas brings. Even past their business, no one believed me. When I described the 2 foreign objects I'd found lodged in the bodies, a couple of my old classmates even inquired whether I was sober. Not being able to find any explanation through my informal channels, I called my boss on the county level. Well, his annoyance with my phone call was crystal clear. The town of Christian Springs was not on his radar, and, in his opinion, mysteries that weren't directly connected to the criminal investigations were better left unexplored. After a long back and forth, he agreed to drive down and investigate the gingerbread men as soon as his schedule cleared up. He suggested that I shouldn't go into details on my reports if I didn't want to undergo a psychological evaluation. Well, I filled out the report as best I could, but the cause of death still ended up as unknown. After a couple more phone calls to old colleagues who didn't pick up the first time around, I gave up. The mystery of the gingerbread man would have to wait until after the holidays. I placed the cookie creatures face down in a glass jar, put on my coat, and drove back home. My wife didn't like me talking about work at home. In fact, she didn't like me talking about work at all. Whenever the question of what I did for a living came up at dinner parties, she'd quickly say I worked with the police or call me a doctor, and then quickly change the topic. When I came home that evening, I didn't mention anything about the gingerbread men, but all night long those slitted eyes haunted me. I dreamed of my son walking into our bedroom in the middle of the night, clutching his stomach. I dreamed of my wife getting up to comfort him, but soon keeling over in pain as well. I dreamed of my family lying on those metal slabs, of me cutting their chests open, of finding nothing but pink mush where their organs should be. When I woke up that morning, I was overjoyed to find my wife sleeping next to me, unharmed by the baked monstrosities that tore through my sleep. But the joy didn't last long. My family might have been alive, but those 2 gingerbread men were still real. They were still waiting for me in the examination room. During breakfast, my son excitedly told me about his last day of school. I knew he went on a field trip to the museum. I'd signed the permission slip for it after all, but all my son could talk about was the gingerbread man his class had made in the morning. I kept on trying to ask him what his favorite dinosaur exhibit was, but all my son could talk about was his newfound interest in baking. The house phone rang. My wife picked it up. Whatever was being said on the other line made her visibly uncomfortable. When she came back to the table, she simply resumed eating. It wasn't until my son went outside to play with his friends that she told me that the school had called. One of my son's classmates had suddenly died. The teachers were calling the parents to let them know. "Chelsea Steeler?" I asked. She immediately noticed the beginning of a conversation she didn't want to have. "Let's not tell him until after Christmas. Let him be a kid for a little longer." I didn't argue. I didn't share the details of what I'd found inside of Steeler's body. Instead, I told my wife that there was some last-minute paperwork I had to take care of in the examination room before I fully clocked out for the holidays. And it wasn't entirely a lie. I did spend some time going through the autopsy report making sure it didn't sound completely mad. But it wasn't the reason I drove back to work that day. My real reasons were lying face down in a glass jar. Yet when I took the jar out, the gingerbread men weren't lying down. They were pressed up against the glass, facing the outside world. There was no doubt in my mind that the creatures had shifted, that they'd somehow stood up in my absence and were looking out into the world with their slitted eyes. For a moment I stood there, confounded by the blood-covered baked goods staring back at me. Yet the longer I stood in the empty examination room, the more I thought about my family. Beyond the corpses, beyond the ripped-up muscle and flesh, I had a family. Back home, my wife and son were waiting for me. I closed the cupboard that held the gingerbread men, shut off the lights, and drove back home. It was difficult to keep the malformed creatures out of my head on the drive back. The mysteries of my professional life dissipated beneath the sheer pleasure of spending time with my family. After lunch, the three of us went outside to build a snowman. 2 big eyes with Christmas ornaments, a thick carrot nose, and a wide grin of coal. The creature that my son had constructed wiped away any memory of the howling gingerbread men in the examination room. Once the snowman in our front yard had been completed and the sun had set, the three of us settled down on the couch and watched a Christmas movie. I scarcely paid any attention to what was on the TV. Whatever was on the screen was irrelevant, just a bright backdrop to a calm evening spent with those I loved. It wasn't until my wife and I were falling asleep that I thought about my work again. Just as she drifted off to sleep, she mentioned that she'd have a talk with our son about bullying. While I was off finishing my paperwork, my son told my wife about one of his classmates tormenting the daughter of the weird religious lady. Apparently the bully had taken the girl's gingerbread man and ate it in front of the whole class, embarrassing the poor kids. "Christine Morgan's daughter?" I asked. "Probably," my wife said, yawning. "Was the bully Chelsea Steeler?" I asked. "I don't know. He didn't use names," she said, yawning again. "We should talk to him about standing up for the weaker kids." For a moment I thought about breaking the unspoken rules of my marriage and telling my wife about the 2 corpses in the examination room, but that moment dragged on for too long. By the time I started to whisper my worries, she was already asleep. My mind was still desperately trying to make connections between the 2 bodies and their gruesome deaths, but I forced my eyes shut and tried to get some rest. I hoped that some sleep would help me forget about the gingerbread man. It didn't. I woke up drenched in sweat with my heart racing. In my dreams, I saw my family sitting in the kitchen making gingerbread men. My wife and son seemed so happy, so full of life, so innocent. Yet the cookies that they made shared none of their joy. Slitted eyes and maws of crimson stared back at me from the kitchen table. Slitted eyes that blinked and maws that chomped. Before I could warn them, before I could save my family, the gingerbread men leapt into action. Soon enough, my wife and son were gone, and all that remained of them was blood and mangled skin. Seeing the kitchen clean and free of death brought a tiny bit of calmness to my mind, but I knew that what I truly needed was sleep. With a generous helping of sleeping pills and a nightcap, I returned back to bed. At first, the thoughts of Morgan and Steeler tugged at my mind, but soon enough, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke up to an empty bed that morning. For a moment, past the chemically induced grogginess of my slumber, I found myself worrying about my family being kidnapped by a group of possessed gingerbread men. Walking down to the kitchen and finding my wife and son safe and sound calmed me somewhat, but the calmness didn't last. They were baking gingerbread men. Their creations were unlike the ones I'd seen in my dreams. The cookie men they made were cheery and happy and full of pep, but that didn't matter to me. All I could think about were those slitted eyes and screaming maws. All I could think about were the 2 gingerbread men standing in my office, waiting. They invited me to join in on the baking, but I busied myself with beer and television. I hoped that alcohol and channel hopping would distract me, yet all I could think about were the bodies. Regardless of how much I drank or how loud the Christmas music blaring from the television was, all I could think about was Morgan, Steeler, and the cookie men that were lodged in their broken corpses. My mind kept on trying to find some semblance of reason in a bewildering world. "Daddy, I made you something." My son's voice cut through the frenzied internal monologue. In his hands he held a little gingerbread man with a bushy moustache and glasses. The facial hair was made of green frosting, and the glasses were far too big for the man's face. But I could tell that the gingerbread man was meant to be a representation of me. "Do you go to school with Grace Morgan?" I asked him. He seemed confused by the question, but eventually he nodded. "Did Grace ever talk about her mother? Did they get along?" I asked him. Gracie's mom was mean, my son said. When the class went to the museum, Gracie's mom was standing outside yelling at us. But did Grace ever talk about her mother? Do you think Grace would ever want to hurt her? Would Grace ever want to hurt Chelsea Steeler? Well, Gracie's mom didn't let her come to the museum with us, and Chelsea was always mean to Gracie, my son said, unsure of my questions. Oh, do you like this gingerbread man I made you? I didn't. Even though the cookie held an innocent smile and was made by the most important person in my life, I could barely look at it. Yet, as uncomfortable as I was, the pride in my son's eyes was undeniable. I accepted his cookie. I knew full well that the effigy in my hands was a product of love, but all I could imagine was the little gingerbread man tearing through my insides. "Are you going to eat it, Dad?" he asked. "I promise it's not bad. Mom helped me." I almost told him that I wasn't hungry, or that I'd eat the cookie later, but the pride in my son's eyes was undeniable. The pride in his eyes was more important than the fear in the pit of my stomach. In one swift motion, I decapitated the gingerbread man with my teeth. Once I was sure his head was crushed enough to not do me any harm, I drowned the chunks of gingerbread with a gulp of beer. Tasty," I said, but I wasn't able to mask my discomfort. That evening, as my wife and I wrapped up the Christmas presents, she asked me if I was all right. Both her and my son had noticed that something was bothering me. That evening, she was willing to talk about my problems, be they work-related or not. Yet by then my fear of the gingerbread men had grown to such an intensity that it couldn't be put into words. I just told her that work was a bit more stressful than usual this year, but I'd be fine eventually. She asked me if I wanted to talk about it, but I didn't. I couldn't. She tried to get me to open up a couple more times, but eventually, with the lights off and the presents packed beneath the tree, I was left alone with my thoughts. And my thoughts were singular. I shouldn't have been driving that night. I'd drunk enough throughout the day for it to be a bad idea, and to make things worse, there was a powerful blizzard that swept through the town that Christmas Eve. Yet I knew that unless I got some closure, I wouldn't be able to sleep. So I drove through the curtain of snow until I could see the faint lights of the Christian Springs Morgue. The absurdity of it all was a steady drumbeat in the back of my head, but it wasn't until I was standing in the darkness of my office that I consciously acknowledged how insane my trip was. There was nothing to be achieved from closer examination. Morgan and Steeler were dead. There was nothing I could do to bring them back. I almost convinced myself to turn around and go back home. Almost. Just as I was about to turn around and walk away, I heard something. I heard the faintest of taps coming from the cupboard in which I kept the gingerbread men. Like little claws knocking on glass. Like little gingerbread men trying to make their way out. With my heart in my throat, I opened up the cupboard. Stuck in their glass prison, the two gingerbread men stood there, staring straight at me. They were no longer standing in the spread-out pose in which I'd first found them. Each of them had one of their blood-caked limbs extended, as if they were about to knock on the glass again. I stared at them, waiting for them to move again, waiting for something to happen that would convince me I had not gone insane. In the dim light of my office, I thought that I could see their eyes twitch. I thought I could see the slightest bit of stifled movement in their mouths. But before I could steady myself to properly look, my phone rang. It was my wife. She woke up in the middle of the night to find her husband missing, to find the car missing. She asked 2 questions. She asked whether I was safe and whether I was having an affair. The implication that I would be even capable of being unfaithful hurt me, but as I assured her that I would never break our marriage vows, I realized how far I'd let my mind drift. I closed the cupboard, slid down to the floor of the examination room, and told her everything. I told her about Steeler and Morgan's unfathomable internal damage. I told her about the gingerbread men. I told her about how scared I was. She listened patiently, and with each word that left my lips, with each part of my insane story that I described, I found myself less and less scared. Well, the cause of death was still a mystery, but the pure act of explaining the gingerbread theory made it seem less inconceivable. The murderous gingerbread men were not real. What was real was my worried wife who was waiting for me at home. Once I was all talked out, she asked me to come home. I did. As I shut off the lights and left the examination room, however, the tiniest bit of doubt slithered into my mind. I ignored it and drove back home. The steadily rotating cast of extended family members that came through our house kept me occupied for the next couple of days. All worries of murderous gingerbread men disappeared beneath the fear that my mother-in-law inspired in me, but that fear wasn't something that haunted my dreams. That fear was manageable. When my wife and I had decided to tell our son about Chelsea Steeler, he didn't seem overly concerned. Apparently his friends had already told him, just about everyone from his class knew as soon as the playground rumour mill got going. He just never brought it up because he knew that Mummy didn't like talking about death in the house. The kids seemed pretty comfortable about the concept of mortality. But, well, what can one expect from a child whose father works with the police? A day before New Year's, I got called back into work. Another overdose from a town nearby. The ghastly gingerbread men had left my mind completely by then. I simply consigned them to be a part of some minor mental breakdown. Yet when I entered the examination room, the thoughts of those little slitted eyes came flooding back. The cupboard was opened, and there was a broken glass on the floor. The gingerbread man had escaped. I spent most of January sleepless. I kept on thinking that somehow those two strange creatures made of gingerbread would come and track me down, that they would hurt my family and me because I was aware of their existence. But they didn't. Life carried on as normal. My boss agreed that Morgan and Steeler's injuries were difficult to explain, but he also insisted that they were not important enough to investigate. After the first day of classes, my son informed me that Grace Morgan left town to go live with her grandparents, and that no one was particularly sad with the school bully disappearing off campus. Once it became clear that no murderous baked goods were coming after me and my family, the thoughts of those slit-eyed creatures drifted away into the realm of pointless mystery. Still don't understand what I saw the Christmas of 2003, but I resigned myself to the fact that I never will understand. Sometimes, however, when I find myself sitting in a bar after a medical examiner conference and colleagues start sharing stories of the bizarre and unexplained, I tell my tale of the gingerbread men. And sometimes, when the booze is flowing freely and people's tongues loosen, they tell me that I'm not the only coroner who's found baked goods inside of a mangled corpse. Thoughts are indeed powerful. They create realities, but alone they are not enough. Thoughts require our desire to lead a journey, our commitment to the experiences that life brings along, and the luck that we create in life. Now we flip the coin to its other side, with Buddy, the Ugly Gingerbread Boy. The skies were the color of generous chocolate milk with clouds of bright cotton candy. From those clouds, like a welcome summer drizzle, came gummy bears. There wasn't a corner of Candyland where you couldn't bend down and grab a handful of the chewy treats to prolong your sugar high. You could eat gummies off the street and no one would yell at you. My mother didn't believe in heaven. She believed in the blinding light of an interrogation room where every soul was observed under the searing lens of religious dogma. Sugar was sin. Television was sin. Imagination was sin. The ice cream-tipped skyscrapers of Candyland would occasionally drip creamy goodness down to the licorice-paved streets below, but their true appeal was on the ground floor. Behind their caramel glass windows, there were televisions, giant screens of bright colour that would beam exciting, forbidden cartoons out into the world for me to watch. I'd spend hours behind those storefronts, licking the glass, indulging in the stories that Mother considered to be the work of Satan. School wasn't any better. At first, I was excited at the prospect of a place where I'd be free of Mother's fanatic raving, but Chelsea Steeler made sure that my suffering wasn't solely contained to my house. Well, she should have been in grade 3, but she was still in grade 1. 3 years don't make much of a difference in the adult world, but they do in the realm of children. They make a big difference. She was a head taller than anyone else in the class. She had the reach of a prize fighter, the jawline of an adult. She was also mean, really mean. Beyond the bright screens of the televisions, there were dark alleys of dark chocolate, and in those dark alleys, handsome men in long, flowing trench coats stood and mumbled in dark, soothing tones. They told me jokes which I did not understand, but I laughed anyway. I knew the jokes were dirty, and I knew Mother would disapprove, but I also laughed because it brought a smile to their dark, chiseled faces, and bringing joy into the world made me happy. I knew they loved me. Everyone in Candyland loved me. In Candyland I had friends, and with those friends I would laugh and dance and sing and go on adventures. But sometimes when I needed to be alone, I would climb up on top of one of the skyscrapers and watch the world beyond the city. Out in the marshmallow hills there were long-legged spider creatures of stiletto heels and breasts. The majestic animals roamed the world and breathed big tufts of orange smoke into the sky from their pink-tipped eyeballs. On the windy days, when smells of the candy-coated nature travelled through the city, you could smell the gentlest hint of cinnamon in the air. I spent most of my childhood in Candyland. It was the only place where I could find respite from Mother's fire and brimstone preaching and Chelsea Steeler's angry fists. But the older I got, the more I realized that escaping my miserable life through daydreams wouldn't change anything. When I was young, I didn't think there was any amount of candy that would make the suffering end. But I was wrong. The tired announcement from Mrs. Abassi about the last day of classes before winter break was accompanied by a lively parade in Candyland. I would be forbidden to join the class on the end-of-day field trip to the Natural History Museum. Mother refused to sign any permission slip that would lead me to seeing dinosaurs, but a celebration was still in order. Before the field trip, the class would gather in some home ed kitchen and bake gingerbread men. The concept thrilled me to my tiny 7-year-old core. I'd get to use my hands and my imagination to make something. I'd get to design my own little gingerbread man. I'd get to design my own little friend. Marching bands of gingerfolk filled the streets of Candyland in celebration, and when I wasn't dancing or singing from the sheer joy I felt in my heart, I was surrounded by sugary suitors. They all suggested that I paint their face on my new friend. They were all beautiful, and I told them that. But deep inside I'd already chosen the smile that I would see on my gingerbread companion. I'd already chosen his name too. He'd be Buddy, the gingerbread boy. He couldn't be a man. A gingerbread man would be too big. If I hid a man in my room, Mother would find him and crush him to little bits before the week was over. No, Buddy would be a tiny gingerbread boy, a friend I could tuck away in my bedstand drawer and hold for safety if Mother's feverish midnight prayers ever got too scary. When the day of the gingerbread came, my hands were steadier than they ever were in any arts and crafts class. I wanted to make sure that my new friend would be perfect. As I worked away at his blue frosting pinstripe suit, the rest of the classroom disappeared. The arguing kids, the cheesy Christmas music, Mrs. Abassi reading a newspaper by the desk. The outside world faded away and I was left alone with my masterpiece. I was going to make him so beautiful. He'd have the brightest smile and the biggest eyes. After he'd be done and dolled up, everyone would say, "Wow, what a handsome gingerbread boy." But no one outside of my imagination has ever said that. Just as I was about to start applying frosting to the gingerbread boy's face, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. Reality was dragging me back out of my imagination in the form of Chelsea Steeler's heavy fist wrapped around my hair. Within seconds, I was down on the floor and looking up at the third-grade giant observing my tiny friend. I got up and pleaded with her in strained whispers to leave the gingerbread boy alone. I told her that he didn't do anything to her, that there was no need for destruction. She ignored me. Instead, her big dumb eyes drifted from my faceless creation to the jagged mess of red frosting on her table. I begged her to leave him be, yet she refused to listen. Instead, she grabbed the tube of frosting that I'd used for Buddy's red shoes and squeezed it over his blank face. 2 quick squirts followed by a squeeze long enough to empty the whole tube. That's all it took. Suddenly, the potential smile and bright eyes were replaced with an eternal scream. Looking back at me from my table were 2 sharp slits for eyes and a hungry mouth opened so wide that it blared into his blue suit. "If you tattle," Chelsea Steeler said, in that dark, cruel voice of hers, "I will kill you." And then, as if she hadn't just crushed all my dreams, she walked back over to her desk without a care in the world. Mrs. Abbasi continued reading her newspaper for a couple more minutes before she came around to collect our gingerbread creations to put in the oven. I didn't resist. I was still in shock from seeing my new friend getting disfigured in a senseless act of violence. The television was rolled into the room and the class was treated to the first 30 minutes of Pinocchio on a groaning VCR. The movie was barely audible past the excited whispers of my classmates about the imminent field trip. But I wasn't watching the screen anyway. My eyes stayed glued to the oven. Somewhere in that furnace of hot light, Buddy's scars were becoming permanent. By the time the cookies were done, no one cared about the movie or the baked treats. Conversation was solely focused on how excited everyone was to see the dinosaurs that would be on display in the museum. Hearing my classmates talk about how much fun they would have in a place denied to me by my mother's religious fanaticism hurt worse than Chelsea Steeler's numbing punches. But it wasn't until I was handed the gingerbread boy's corpse that my heart truly broke. Mrs. Abbasi left me alone in the classroom, the tape of Pinocchio a flickering backdrop to my personal tragedy. I sat there, holding my only friend in the palm of my hand. His body was still warm from the oven, but his manic scream of a mouth sent chills down my spine. Buddy would forever be broken, and I would forever be lonely. It was a mournful day in Candyland. Rain, real rain, fell from the sky like big swollen tears. The gummy bears on the ground shed all of their coloring and turned into amorphous blobs of gelatin. The ice cream-tipped skyscrapers leaked watery milk all over the pavement, and everything was sticky. All of the televisions had been turned off, and the only thing that cut through the silence of the city were murmured condolences from the inhabitants as they gathered around me. The gingerbread boy might have been massacred, but I will always have them, they said. Candyland would be here for me in this tough time, they said. But then an infernal screech cut through the marshmallow hills. The long-legged creatures scarcely had time to turn before the intruders descended upon them. Within moments, their mammary bodies were bursting dark red frosting across the fluffy white land. Pterodactyls descended from the sky. The cries of the infernal lizard birds on the horizon were soon joined by shrieks of panic from the streets of Candyland. Heavy hooves of beaked monstrosities shook the city to its foundation. The dinosaurs that I was forbidden to see in the real world, were forcing their way into the safe haven of my imagination, and they were destroying it. Massive tails broke through the caramel glass windows of the storefront and sent sparkling electricity out into the wet world. Horns cut their way through innocent bystanders, sending blood and candy spilling into the streets. The skyscrapers crumbled beneath the weight of blunt, prehistoric force. The rain had turned into a downpour. Clouds, real storm clouds, gathered above the city and pelted it with cold slugs of water and sharp lightning. Candyland shook with the sounds of thunder and destruction, but beyond the mayhem there was something else. Beyond the mayhem there were sobs. back in my first grade classroom, with Pinocchio quietly begging to become a real boy on the television, I found myself crying. I didn't just cry because of the gingerbread boy. I didn't just cry because of the museum trip I was excluded from. I cried because there was no way out. Chelsea's Steelers fists would forever haunt me. Mother's screeching voice would forever haunt me. And Candyland could never sustain their horrible, cruel presence in my life. I cried because I knew there was no escape from the life I was living. As I cried, I held him in my hands like a scared child holds a safety blanket, as if he could help me, as if he could deliver me from my suffering. But I knew in my heart of hearts that he was just a disfigured cookie. Yet as the tears flowed onto the little gingerbread boy, a glint of movement grabbed my attention. The world beyond my eyes was shimmering beneath the wetness of my tears, but for a split second I thought I saw a twitch in the pinstripe suit. For a breathless moment I watched the gingerbread in my hands, searching for movement. Soon enough, I didn't just see it, I felt it. With trembling hands and an unsteady mind, I placed Buddy on my desk and watched. For the first time in my young life, I made an active effort to suppress my imagination. Candyland wasn't real. Gingerbread Man couldn't come to life. There was no conceivable way for Buddy to be moving on his own. For a gentle moment of calm, I almost believed my own lies, but then, with a shaking groan, Buddy's red maw twitched. Buddy! The disfigured gingerbread boy rasped through his impossible mouth. I am Buddy. The crimson slits on his face struggled to blink, but after a couple of frantic twitches they were focused straight on me. With effort, the gingerbread boy pulled himself up to his unsteady feet and started to walk towards me. His arms were outstretched. His red mouth drooped across his torso. I am Buddy, he said. I am Buddy the gingerbread boy. Every muscle of my tiny being was seized with panic. I couldn't look away, I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. Instead of a cry for help, all I managed to let out was a terrified wheeze. With each crumb-filled step, Buddy's footing became more confident. Soon enough, he was marching towards me like the friendly gingerbread men that Mrs. Abbasi would read us stories about in the library. But those gingerbread men were friendly and pretty. Buddy was neither. Buddy! He strained as he hopped off my desk and into my lap. I am Buddy, the gingerbread boy. My body continued to ignore all of my panic-riddled orders as Buddy started to crawl across the itchy sweater I was wearing. I was frozen in a frenzy of fear, and the only thing I could manage to do was shake. Yet my convulsions did little to stop Buddy's progress. He just gripped my clothes tighter, tearing away clumps of fluff as he traveled up my body. His fingerless hands pinched my skin with every grab of flesh that he took, but soon enough his climb stopped. Buddy had his rough hands gripped around my throat. Each frenzied breath my body demanded became more difficult to grasp. I am Buddy, the gingerbread boy, he said, squeezing, and I love you. My heartbeat pushed against his unrelenting body. The world was becoming faint. I could feel myself drifting off. I gathered every ounce of energy I had and attempted to speak. You're hurting me, I managed to whimper. As if a spell had been broken, the pressure on my throat immediately loosened, and Buddy came tumbling down to the bottom of my sweater. For a moment he struggled in an embrace of wool, but soon enough his head peeked out. The red slits in his face looked up at me in adoration, and his scream of a mouth raised into an apologetic smile. I am sorry, he said, sitting up. I do not mean to hurt you. I just want to be friends. Friends? I asked, my breath returning, but the shock of his words making me breathless again. You want to be friends with me? Friends, he nodded. I love you, and I love Candyland, and I want to be your friend." His mouth still tore into his body, and his eyes still looked like two sharp cuts of a knife, but somehow there was an affectionate air about the creature. He was completely deformed, but somewhere inside of that torn-up face, I could see him. I could see Buddy. "I'd like to be your friend, Buddy," I whispered. "I'd like it very much." Without a moment's hesitation, Buddy scrambled up my sweater and back towards my neck, but this time he didn't choke me. This time he hugged me. I don't know what we talked about first. All I know is that we talked. We talked the same way that the other kids would sit and chat about the colour of the sky, or how snowmen were neat, or what their favourite pizza topping was. My first conversation with a real friend was more calming than I could have ever imagined. Yet, as we chatted, our conversation drifted from life-affirming small talk to more painful topics. Every word I said about Chelsea Steeler or Mother drained the joyfulness out of the gingerbread boy's face. And soon enough, the gaping hole in Buddy's chest wasn't smiling anymore. It had turned into a violent snarl. "No one treats my friend like that," he yelled, his stretched mouth turning the shade of blood. "You have to fight back. You can't let them hurt you like that." I asked him how I could fight back, how I could stop the constant barrage of sadness that the two brought into my life. I begged for an answer to my suffering. Buddy's slitted eyes furrowed into deep thought. A couple times the giant red splotch at his core moved as if it was about to announce a plan, but nothing came of it. "I do not know, friend," he finally said, "but together we can defeat them. Together we can rebuild Candyland and make life a song." "Together," I whispered. Moments later, the door to the classroom opened to a horde of happy kids clutching plastic dinosaurs. On any other occasion, I would have felt jealous of their toys and the fun afternoon they were so loudly chatting about. But with Buddy snugly sitting in my sweater, I was completely content with what I had. When Mrs. Abbasi started writing out our winter break assignments on the chalkboard, I put Buddy next to my day planner. All of those workbooks that we had to read, all of those art projects we had to start, I knew that I'd work on them with my gingerbread friend by my side. Yet as I copied down the writing on the chalkboard, I suddenly felt a push from the side. Before I knew what was happening, I was lying on the floor. The other kids were quietly giggling. Chelsea Steeler had pushed me out of my chair. Mrs. Abbasi turned around from the chalkboard and told me to keep my hijinks for after the bell rang and continued writing down the assigned reading. Not wanting to antagonize Chelsea before my walk back home, I didn't say anything. I figured if I just kept my head low for the next couple of minutes, I'd get to enjoy winter break with Buddy. But I was wrong. As soon as I was back at my desk, my heart skipped a beat. The gingerbread boy was gone from my table. Without a word, Chelsea Steeler held up Buddy between two fingers. He was dangerously close to her monstrous jaw. I pleaded loud enough to get the attention of the other kids. Soon enough, the whole class, with the exception of Mrs. Abbasi, was watching our exchange. I begged Chelsea, I pleaded for Buddy's life, promising to do anything she wanted as long as she let him go. But in response, she just smiled. "Too bad I'm hungry," she said in that dark voice of hers. And then she swallowed him whole. I've always been a quiet child, but when I saw my only friend disappear in that dark gullet, I let out a scream that brought in concerned faculty from other classrooms. My heart exploded in a white-hot rage. I yelled at Chelsea, calling her every bad word that I'd picked up over the years, and even some that I made up on the spot. But in response, she just smiled. I breathlessly explained what happened to Mrs. Abbasi, but in response she just asked Chelsea if I was telling the truth. "No," Chelsea said in that dark voice of hers. "She's making it all up." I yelled for the other kids, pleading for someone to take my side, begging for someone to tell the truth, but everyone just looked down on their shoelaces. Chelsea Steeler was not known for being kind to snitches, and no one wanted to get hurt on my account. Everyone here is lying, especially Chelsea Steeler, I yelled in exasperation. This did not sit well with Chelsea. For a split second, I could see her dark eyes burrowing into me, vowing revenge, but soon enough they disappeared beneath a curtain of tears. I was crying again, but this time they weren't quiet sobs. This time I wailed hard enough for my throat to hurt. I tried going back to Candyland, but there was nothing left for me to go back to. The city was a collection of smashed glass and bent candy canes. Not a soul was left to greet me or talk to me. Even the dinosaurs had left. All that remained of my daydream kingdom was a wet, sticky wasteland. Mrs. Abbasi made me sit out in the hallway until the final bell rang because I was deemed distracting to the class. But once everyone in the grade had left the classroom, she invited me in. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but somewhere past the tiredness, there was understanding. She said she knew Chelsea was a problematic classmate, and that regardless of what had happened, I deserved to be able to have my own gingerbread man. There was still some dough and a couple of tubes of frosting that I could take home for winter break. Well, I knew Mother would never let me make a mockery of God's image in the oven, and I was still recovering from the heartbreak of losing Buddy. But Mrs. Abbasi's gift was a gentle band-aid for my broken soul. That band-aid didn't stay for long. Moments after I left school, just as I was starting to daydream about how I would bake a new gingerbread boy in the middle of the night, I felt a sharp pain in my jaw. Before I knew what was happening, I was lying on the pavement with a loose milk tooth rattling in my mouth. "No one calls me a liar," she said in that dark voice of hers. With the sun burning behind her, she looked like a fiery giant. The titan of a third grader bent down and reached for my backpack. I was too shocked from the sucker punch to put up a fight as the first strap came off, but as I realized that Chelsea Steeler was going to take away my one chance to make another gingerbread friend, I started to resist. Deep inside of my soul, I could hear Buddy cheering me on, telling me that if I just stood up for myself, things would get better. But they didn't. With another punch, Chelsea Steeler knocked me back to the ground. "No one calls me a liar," she said in that dark voice of hers as she slipped on my little bag. "This backpack is mine now." And then, as if she hadn't just knocked out one of my teeth and stolen my only chance at a friend, she marched off down the street. I had no tears left to cry. I just sat up on the pavement, sniveling, watching the bully march off into the sunset with my backpack. The pain in my mouth was bad, but I knew that the tongue-lashing mother would give me at home for losing my bag would be worse. But I knew I couldn't do anything. If I charged at Chelsea and tried to get my belongings back, she'd just hit me again. So I sat there and watched Chelsea walk away. But she didn't walk far. For a second I thought she'd just turned around to admire her handiwork, to really soak in how miserable she'd made me. But as she rushed back to me, there was no malice in her eyes. For the first time ever, I saw something other than hatred and dumb rage in Chelsea Steeler's face. I saw fear. "Help," she said in a voice unlike her own. Her massive hand was squeezing her huge stomach. "Help," she repeated, terrified. Chelsea threw my backpack at me, as if that would stop whatever pain she was in, but it didn't. "Help," she yelled at me, frantically punching her belly. With her jaw wide open, she froze. The rest of the words struggled to come out of her mouth. Her tongue wiggled at me in strained effort. There was something in her mouth. There was someone in her mouth. Past Chelsea Steeler's blocky teeth, I saw two slitted eyes looking back at me. Buddy was covered in mucus, but aside from that, he was the same disfigured gingerbread boy I'd befriended an hour prior. He had his fingerless hands wrapped around her tongue as if it were a rodeo bull and he was a cowboy. When my eyes drifted from Chelsea's terrified stare and met his malformed eyes, Buddy winked, and then, with one big leap, he disappeared back down Chelsea Steeler's throat. He took her tongue along for the ride. She left a long trail of red across the pavement as she stumbled away over to the playground. And that's where she collapsed, and that's where she stayed. The adults panicked and screamed and huddled around her and demanded someone call an ambulance. As the chaos in the playground unraveled, no one even noticed me. I just stood there and watched. I stood there and hoped that Buddy would leap out of her bloody throat and jump into my arms. But he didn't. By the time the uniformed men loaded Chelsea Steeler into the back of an ambulance with a blanket covering her pain grimace, I knew that Buddy wasn't coming back to me. Walking home through the dark, I also knew that Mother would be furious about me staying out late, and that the prayers and chores I would have to do for penance would take up valuable time I could spend rebuilding Candyland. And yet, as I walked through the lamplit streets, I found a lightness in my step that I'd never felt before. Half of my problems were suddenly gone. My mother was as furious as expected. She ranted and raved and accused me of things I've never done, but in her anger she forgot to check the contents of my bag. That night, as she screamed prayers for my filthy soul at her invisible god, I escaped back to Candyland. In the ashes of the city, my friends gathered. Gummy bears and men in trench coats and, of course, the gingerbread suitors. They all sat around a little fire in the town square and tried to make sense of it all. The destruction of the city, the death which the dinosaurs had brought upon the community, it was all too much for them. They were all hopeless. But I raised their spirits. I told them of Buddy's victory over Chelsea Steeler. I told them how I would start making friends as soon as school would start again. I told them I was ready to stand up for myself. I told them I had solutions. Half of my problems were gone. All I needed to do was finish the job. That night, once Mother's screaming had died down, I went to the kitchen and turned on the oven. Mrs. Abbasi had given me enough dough for at least 5 gingerbread boys. When I was young, I didn't think there was any amount of candy that would make the suffering end. But I was wrong. So always nice to be working with an author that I haven't worked with before. And this one was a particular treat. A couple of phenomenal stories right there. And, well, he's got his own YouTube channel, so I've linked to it in the video description. Please go and check out his own work as well. He records his own stories, and I think he does some other stories from other authors as well. But really good. And he gives advice to other writers looking to get started. And, of course, that's what I thrive on. Dr. Creepen's Vault, the subreddit I set up so you could share your stories with me. And pretty much everything I do comes from there, with, as with tonight's case, the odd exception here and there. But I'm always looking forward to stories from you all. Started writing myself, so maybe some of my own stories will be appearing on the channel next year. Next year, 2021. Full of promises after the shit show we've been going through recently. But anyway, enough of that for one evening. Might be back tomorrow in some shape or form, not quite sure yet. It's that week between Christmas and New Year when we don't really know what to do with ourselves, so I'm going to try and keep you entertained as best I can. Well, till next time, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.